Buick, luxury and surprising performance. Hi, I'm Joe Ferguson. Welcome to Talking Vehicles with Joe. This is part 3 on my history of Buick. Now, in part 2, I took us from the post-war era, the end of World War II, up through the 1960s, although I didn't talk much about the Riviera. So I'm going to do that first, and then we'll get into the 70s, 80s, and beyond, right on up through the present time. The Buick Riviera was introduced in 1963, and the Riviera came about because it was originally a project for Cadillac. Cadillac felt like they needed a vehicle or General Motors felt like they needed a vehicle that would compete with the surprising Ford Thunderbird. The Thunderbird had really kind of established that personal luxury coupe market and was doing extremely well for Ford. And Thunderbird really kind of defied the brand image and did not really telegraph the economic position of the buyer. Thunderbird was an affordable car that looked like it was more expensive than it really was. And so General Motors saw that there was a personal luxury coupe market coming, and people wanted to buy it because it denoted and conveyed a certain image of prestige. So they began working on a vehicle that was codenamed LaSalle, and frankly was intended to be introduced as a LaSalle, a step between Buick and Cadillac. They designed a beautiful automobile, but Cadillac at the last minute essentially rejected the idea. They didn't want a low-end Cadillac to be in the marketplace. So General Motors has this beautiful vehicle that they've designed. They don't want to let that design die. They offer it to all the other divisions and say, hey, we have this really beautiful car that we designed. You can have it. The only requirement is that you change nothing. You have to produce it and roll it out as designed. Well, none of the other divisions wanted to do that because they all had their trademark styling cues that they wanted to add to it and didn't want to roll it out just as it was designed. When it was offered to Buick, they looked at it and said, sure, we'll do that. And they called the car the Riviera. Now, Riviera was a name Buick had used for some upscale show cars, and the four-door hardtops that were first introduced by GM were called Rivieras. In other words, you could have a Roadmaster Riviera because it was a pillarless hardtop. So the Riviera name had a certain connotation of being an upscale or a higher level of automobile. And the Riviera was a beautiful car, and it sold extremely well for Buick. They sold 40-some thousand copies of it. The first generation of it was introduced in 1963. It got a restyle in 1966, I believe it was, and that lasted clear up through the 1970 model year. In 1971, Riviera was once again restyled into the boat tail style, or the boat tail design that Bill Mitchell loved so much. He was entering the twilight years of his career at General Motors, and he wanted a boat tail car to be part of his legacy. So they did the Riviera in 1971 in a boat tail style. Now, I've seen some of the early drawings, some of the early sketches that were going to be the Riviera, and the Riviera was going to be on a smaller platform, have more distinct lines than what it finally came out with, and frankly was going to be beautiful. But a decision was made that Toronado, Riviera, and Eldorado were all going to share the large car platform and certain components of the large vehicle, like windshield, roofline, etc. And so the Riviera got stretched, and frankly, it didn't work quite as well on that big platform. Now, the Riviera was still, to me, a very, very handsome and unique and distinct automobile. but sales plummeted. Buick was selling roughly half of the boat tail Rivieras as they had the previous generation, where they were clicking out 30 to 40,000 units a year. The boat tail Riviera had dropped down to 20,000 units a year, or maybe just over 20,000 units. And so in 1974, Riviera got restyled and became much, much more conventional. Frankly, in my eye, from 74 to 78, it looked more like a LeSabre that had some special headlight and taillight treatments. So that's kind of the story of the Riviera in a nutshell. But in the 1970s, Buick continued the tradition of building large, comfortable, luxurious, upscale automobiles, or they did have the midsize Skylark. Now, in the General Motors midsize redesign of 1973 that became known as the Colonnade cars, the Skylark became the Century. Buick brought the Century name back and named their midsize car the Century. Now, interestingly, Buick also was really focusing on performance in the 1970s. They had the GS, the Grand Sport, and the GSX, which were extremely hot automobiles, among some of the fastest production muscle cars that had ever been produced because of Buick's mighty 455 and the incredible amount of torque that engine produced. And in 1973, the Grand Sport on the Century, the Colonnade platform, with the 455 was still a formidable muscle car and had strong performance. Of course, through the 1970s, performance waned because of tightening emission controls and the fact that the car companies really weren't focusing on performance because the insurance companies were choking down the ability of anybody to be able to afford them. So through the 1970s, Buick focused on comfortable cars that were finely made, had high levels of appointments, and all the luxury that you could possibly add onto the car was available. In 1974, Buick reintroduced the Park Avenue name for its Electra model. The Park Avenue was an upscale version of the Electra. So you'd have the Electra 225, the Electra Limited, and also a Park Avenue option. And the Park Avenue was the one that had the pillowed seats. I think Buick saw the Olds Regency and what happened to the sales of Oldsmobile when the Regency name was brought out with the upper scale trim and the pillowed seats, and decided they needed something like that for their vehicle. They didn't want to lose sales to Oldsmobile. So the Park Avenue was introduced and instantly became very, very popular and was very successful for Buick. So Buick goes through the 1970s, still putting some emphasis on performance, but they were now doing it through their 231 cubic inch V6 and turbocharging it to get more power from it and putting it in the smaller vehicles. The Century, in 1978, they introduced the Buick Regal. It had a turbocharged V6 available to it. And so there was still a performance emphasis at Buick while they also were emphasizing luxury. Now, much to Buick's dismay, through the late 1970s and 1980s, the demographic of a Buick buyer was getting older and older and older. And Buick knew that sooner or later, that was going to create a real problem for them. Because while the older people were more affluent and would buy a more upscale vehicle and were adding the upscale options like the Limited and the Park Avenue onto their vehicles more frequently, that pretty soon those customers weren't going to be available because, frankly, they would die off. And Buick knew that it needed youth to come back into the brand. And so thus they continued to emphasize performance. And when the midsize cars were restyled in the 1978 year, Buick again began to re-emphasize performance. And in 1982, rolled out the GS, the Grand Sport model again, with the high horsepower turbocharged V6. High horsepower for the time, it was about 200 horsepower. And the vehicle, frankly, was a real performance car, would run with just about anything that any car maker was offering at that point that wasn't an exotic, like a Ferrari or something like that. As a matter of fact, there were rumors that on the track that some professional drivers had taken a turbocharged GS and outrun a Corvette with it, which of course would be an embarrassment to America's sports cars. So that fact was never published. Particularly when Buick went delved more deeply into performance and got the turbocharged V6 up to 245 horsepower, and on the GSX got it up to over 300 horsepower. There are spy pictures of one running around one of the test tracks with a bumper sticker on it that says, "I brake for Corvettes." So Buick was continuing to push this performance image, along with producing high-quality, luxurious, upscale automobiles. And through the 1980s and 1990s, Buick had a fair amount of market share. But again, their demographic was older. They had attracted some younger buyers with the performance, but basically they weren't sticking with Buick. Buick soldiers on through the 2000s into 2010s. And of course, General Motors went bankrupt in 2008, and they had to shed a couple of the divisions. There are a lot of people that felt Buick should go away. But one of the things that Buick has going for it, and will continue to have going for it for a long time, is the Chinese market. You see, the Chinese emperors before the Communist Revolution drove Buicks. Chiang Kai-shek drove a Buick, and the Buick name became associated in China with prestige, with power, and had the same connotation as what a brand like Cadillac or Lincoln or Mercedes-Benz has here in the United States, or Lexus or Infiniti or any of the other premium brands for that matter. So Buick is still a very, very strong contender in China, and a lot of vehicles are sold. Now, in 2011, Buick introduced the Encore, a very, very small, subcompact, actually, a crossover SUV type vehicle. And that started Buick on the move towards becoming an all SUV company. As a matter of fact, 2019 was the last year that Buick produced an automobile, the Regal, which was actually a German Opel. But it also was the last passenger car type vehicle that Buick produced. Buick today is all SUVs. They've got the subcompact Envista, the compact Encore GX, mid-sized Envision, and the full-size Enclave. And that's all they produce. So what's in the future for Buick? Well, I would have told you just a few years ago that Buick's future was endangered, because while you see electric vehicles in all the other GM divisions, Cadillac and Chevrolet, you don't see any in Buick. And, you know, with the mandate that was issued from the previous presidential administration, that by 2035, I believe it was, all vehicles were going to have to be electric. It didn't look like Buick was going to have a future. But I think that's changed now. I think, you know, the fact that mandate doesn't exist anymore, and gasoline vehicles are still predominantly the choice of motorists here in the United States. I think Buick's future will continue to be one that they'll be able to continue to exist. Now, frankly, all of their models are getting to be a little bit long in tooth, with the exception of the Envista, which I believe is only in its third or fourth model year. But all the other models have been around for, 6-7 years right now. And Buick is due for a big refresh of all their vehicles. It'll be interesting to see what they do and how they do that. And I think that will determine a lot about what Buick's future is going to be. But at least for now, Buick will continue to be the step between Chevrolet and Cadillac, and offer motorists an upscale choice, a vehicle with some premium interior appointments, some premium exterior appointments and styling, and a little bit more than a Chevrolet, but not as much as a Cadillac, let's call it. Anyway, I'm Joe Ferguson. Thanks for watching Talking Vehicles with Joe and going through me on my history of Buick. And again, I know I was very brief and didn't touch on all the aspects of what Buick was, is, and is going to be. But hopefully that gives you a little better feel for what Buick is. If you like this and you want to see some more histories, let me know in the comments. Hit the like button, share it with somebody you think might be interested in it, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next Friday on another Talking Vehicles with Joe.